Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source for viewers both in the UK on the BBC News channel and around the world on BBC World News. We'll have the very latest on the coronavirus pandemic and all the main stories globally. And we're going to start in the US and a landmark ruling for LGBT rights. The US Supreme Court has ruled it's illegal for workers to be fired for their sexuality. Protesters have been marching over the police killing of another African-American man whose death has been declared a homicide. His wife has spoken out.
It's just going to be a long time before I heal. It's going to be a long time before this family heals.
And as I was mentioning, we'll have comprehensive coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. We're going to begin in Europe, though, because countries across the continent opened their borders to visitors for the first time in 3 months. And in England, the biggest easing of lockdown as businesses on the high street reopen, in some cases to huge queues. Plus, we'll have updates from Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, which are struggling to keep COVID-19 under control. Well, we'll turn back to the coronavirus in a minute, but I want to start with this significant decision by the US Supreme Court. It's ruled, as I was saying, that employers who fire workers for being gay or transgender are breaking the country's civil rights laws. It's a major win for LGBTQ workers and their allies. The court ruled 6-3 that federal law, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, should be understood to include sexual orientation. And all of this comes even though many thought the Supreme Court had grown more conservative recently. That's because of the new appointees by President Trump. This is one of them, Judge Neil Gorsuch, but it was Judge Gorsuch who wrote the majority opinion. He said an employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Well, we've yet to have any reaction from President Trump on this, but his Democratic rival for the presidency, Joe Biden, has already tweeted, "Today's decision is another step in our march towards equality for all," he says. The Supreme Court has confirmed the simple but profoundly American idea that every human being should be treated with respect. But we're not done, he adds. Let's bring in Anthony Zerka, who's been covering this for us. Anthony, help me understand the dynamics on the Supreme Court and why some people have been surprised that this ruling went this way.
Well, you have to view this ruling in the context of what the Supreme Court had been doing over the past 2 decades on gay rights issues. Back in the early 2000s, it struck down a Texas ban on sodomy. Then about 15 years later, it legalized gay marriage across the country. So you'd seen this progression in the Supreme Court to expanding an interpretation of gay rights. But that was a different court. And as you mentioned, there were 2 new conservative justices appointed to this court, replacing one of them, Anthony Kennedy, who was the author of those landmark gay rights decisions. So there was a lot of concern among LGBTQ folks that this would be a chance for the court to start to pare back some of this expansive reading, particularly looking at Justice Gorsuch, as you mentioned, Justice Kavanaugh coming onto the court. That ended up not being the case, though, although Kavanaugh did vote with the 3 justices who voted against this reading.
And clearly for people within the LGBTQ community, this is the outcome they were hoping for. But has there been a lot of heat around this? Is there another side to the argument where there's some people who are trying to stop this from happening? And what reasons could they give for trying to stop it?
Well, I think, because this was essentially an argument over a reading of a 1964 law, the protections in this 1964 law that prohibited employment discrimination based on religion, based on race, based on creed, and based on sex. And what they were saying, their arguments were that these members of Congress who passed this law looked at it and said they weren't considering gay rights, they weren't certainly considering transgender rights when they said you couldn't discriminate based on sex. And the idea of sex as something that could be changed by an individual over the course of their lives, that wasn't something that these lawmakers considered. And if Congress wanted to include gay rights, transgender rights in that law, they should go out and pass it explicitly rather than waiting on the court to interpret it itself.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. And there's much more background on that ruling on the BBC News website as well. Now let's turn to a moment of great importance for Europe's efforts to navigate this pandemic, border controls have been lifted after 3 months of them being closed. And of course, the hope is that this has come in time to allow the summer holiday season to help kickstart economies across Europe. Today, all of these countries reopened their borders, either completely or with some restrictions on specific countries. Greece, for example, is allowing tourists from 29 countries, mostly from within the EU. That list, I should say, does not include the UK, Spain or Italy. So if you're watching in any of those places, you still can't go to Greece. Germany is fully opening its borders for travellers from the EU, although there are different advisories for each country. And France is opening its borders too. However, if you're coming from the UK or Spain into France, you have to self-isolate for 2 weeks on arrival. Well, let's stay in France, because in Paris, cafes and restaurants have been allowed to let customers inside from today. Hugh Schofield's there.
I think in France today you really get a feeling that a stage, a period is coming to an end. Today, for the first time in 3 months, you can come to a bar or a cafe or restaurant, have a coffee outside or inside here in Paris. In a week's time, schools are opening across France, not on a voluntary basis as they have been up to now, but compulsory. Children will have to attend, and that'll free up a lot of parents to go back to work. And then on borders, from today, that's opening up as well. For 3 months, France's borders have been tightly controlled. But those controls are coming down now, which means that the movement of goods and people can begin to resume. Is life going to be like it was before? No. Now we have masks, we have social distancing. A lot of people are still going to keep working from home. And above all, we have this severely traumatized economy, a 10% contraction in GDP or output, which means a lot of people losing their jobs, a lot of companies going to the wall.
From France to Austria, thousands of hotel staff there are going to be regularly tested for COVID-19 this summer. That's to try and reassure tourists, particularly those coming from outside of Austria. The aim is to test 65,000 hotel workers a week by the start of July. Bethany Bell has been to one hotel that began COVID testing in the Danube Valley.
The hotel is taking part in a pilot project aimed at trying to reassure tourists, especially those from neighbouring Germany. Every week, its staff is tested for COVID-19. The tests are run by the Red Cross and paid for by the government. Chaba, one of the waiters, says it's about safety for everyone, staff and guests.
That was an easy test, yeah. I think this is very important, yeah. This is what we have to do. And I think the Kirchenby Hotel does everything for the guests to protect our customers.
The government hopes to test up to 65,000 hotel workers a week by the beginning of July.
Where we decided to offer this to the tourism sector because it's very important for Austrian economy, for the whole country more or less, because it's very important to have also in this very special year as much tourists as possible.
Hotels who participate in the testing programme will receive a special certificate, which they can use for their websites and marketing.
Well, let's turn to the UK, because cafes and restaurants certainly are still having to wait here, most schools too, but shops in England have opened for the first time since lockdown, albeit with social distancing in place. Bear in mind, Scotland and Wales still have non-essential shops closed, but for those who did open in England, there was considerable demand. There were even scuffles outside one shop in central London. Sarah Corker has more.
And the restrictions haven't put people off. Thousands waited for Primark to open in Bradford, Birmingham, Liverpool, and this is Bristol. The chain doesn't trade online, and there's pent-up demand. On London's Oxford Street, there was a scrum to get into Nike Town, the crowd ignoring social distancing rules. And in Ashford in Kent, a steady stream of customers, but clothes shopping will be different.
Some of the clothes that you do try on, if you try them on, they're then quarantined. Some of the fitting rooms are actually closed, and brands are extending the returns policy.
But some retailers warn it just won't be profitable to trade with social distancing measures in place. The government say this is a phased path to recovery.
Well, let's learn a little bit more about how social distancing works in shops. Here's Ben Thompson at that outlet centre in Ashford we've just seen to the southeast of London.
Shopping will look and feel very different for quite a while to come. And let me talk you through what you might find. Look, we're at MacArthur Glen in Ashford in Kent in the southeast of England. And this place, they've limited the number of people who can just get in here in the first place. They've halved the car parking spaces. So straight away, even though the car park may look quite busy, there aren't as many people in here, and that's to limit how many can get in. And you might find that you've got a queue before you even get into the shop. So Monica's on the door of this shop, hello, making sure that there are no more than 3 or 4 or 5 people in the shop at any one time. And when you get in here, it might feel a bit different. Advice, of course, about social distancing, reminders on the floor of where you can go. Also advice to perhaps consider paying with a card or contactless payment rather than using cash. And also in some shops that have been in here, especially clothes shops, they're not letting you try on those clothes. They say instead buy it, take it home, and then if there's a problem, bring it back. They don't want to open things like changing rooms. You'll notice too a Perspex screen right here at the checkout to protect staff and customers and make sure they feel confident about coming back to spend. Because look, it's quite an important moment in England getting these non-essential retailers open. And that's because the British Retail Consortium is suggesting it's costing just short of $2 billion every single week to keep these shops closed. So today, yes, opening in a limited capacity, lots of work that they're doing to keep things clean. When people touch and pick up stuff to try it, they'll keep it clean and make sure that other customers are safe.
Well, we started in Washington, then we moved to France, to Austria, to the UK. We're going to switch back to the US and to Georgia because crowds have been gathering at the state capitol building in Atlanta. These are continuing protests over the death of an African-American man who was shot by a white policeman last week. Here are some of the latest pictures we have of this march. Crowds are demanding justice and more broadly an end to racial injustice in US policing. The man who died was 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks. This is the police body cam footage of the night of his death. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation says officers were called to a fast food restaurant because Mr. Brooks had fallen asleep in his car and the car was blocking the drive-through. You can see in this footage from CCTV that the officers then tried to handcuff him. He was killed while fleeing from the officers. Well, a medical examiner has declared this a homicide and Rayshard Brooks' wife has spoken.
I can never get my husband back. I can never get my best friend. I can never tell my daughter, oh, he's coming to take you skating or swimming lessons. So it's just going to be a long time before I heal. It's going to be a long time before this family heals.
That's Rayshard Brooks' wife. We've also heard from his niece.
This entire situation has traumatized me and my entire family, I'm sure for the rest of our lives. My uncle did not die in vain. His life mattered. George Floyd's life mattered. Breonna Taylor's life mattered. Michael Brown's life mattered. Sandra Bland's life mattered. I'm not only asking the city of Atlanta to stand with us, I'm asking for everyone in this nation to stand with us as we seek justice for Rayshard.
Well, Atlanta's police chief has quit over this and the police officer who shot Mr. Brooks has been fired. We're expecting an update later this week on whether the officers will face charges. We've also heard from Rayshard Brooks' cousin speaking about the police.
The trust that we have with the police force is broken. And the only way to heal some of these wounds is through a conviction and a drastic change with the police department.
Let's bring in the BBC's Gary O'Donoghue, who's covering this from Washington. Gary, help me understand. Oh, let's hear from Gary in Washington. I apologise.
Let's bear in mind, this was a pretty routine stop by the police. This was a man who was being accused of drunk driving. He'd fallen asleep in a drive-through burger joint, and he's ended up dead. He's ended up with 2 bullets in the back. And I think that's one of the things that certainly the black community here and most people here don't understand, how that happens with such routine police business.
Another update from the US. President Trump's plan to hold a campaign rally in Tulsa next weekend has been met with opposition from public health experts. They're warning that using a 19,000-seat indoor arena is perhaps not sensible during a pandemic. The president is going ahead with it, though. In fact, he's tweeted almost 1 million people request tickets for the Saturday night rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Maybe, though as Tulsa's population is less than 500,000, that is quite a claim. We'll stay with us here on Outside Source. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to Beijing because it's trying to contain a new coronavirus outbreak linked to an enormous market. We'll have the latest from our correspondent there. Wearing a face mask on public transport is now compulsory in England. Only children under 11 and those with legitimate health reasons are exempt. Tom Burridge has more.
The new rules apply only in England. And this service was heading to Swansea.
For the first stretch of the journey, it's the law that people on board have to cover their faces. But once they go over the border into Wales, it's just a recommendation. So passengers could take their masks off.
It's also just a recommendation to cover your face on public transport in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. You can get a free mask at some stations.
You can also put a filter into
or
it.
follow a tutorial online and make your own.
I'm Rozakis with Outside Source. We're here as ever in the BBC Newsroom. Our lead story comes from the US. There's been a landmark ruling for LGBT rights in the Supreme Court there. It says it's illegal to fire workers based on their sexuality. Now, many countries continue to struggle to keep COVID-19 under control. Let me update you on some of them. First of all, China, where the virus originated. There's a new outbreak of over 50 cases in Beijing, and it's being linked to Asia's biggest wholesale market. The market and 11 nearby neighbourhoods are now under lockdown. And this is significant because there have been no new cases of the virus for close to 2 months in Beijing. Well, this is the market in question. It's called Xinfadi. It's huge. Over 10,000 people work there, and it supplies 80% of Beijing's fresh produce. So that includes meat, seafood and vegetables, some of which come from China, some from abroad. To give you an idea of the scale of this, the market is bigger than 160 football pitches, and it's 20 times bigger than that market in Wuhan where COVID-19 was first detected. I should add, more cases have also been reported at a second market called Yuchuan Dongcai, which is several kilometres away. Now, Chinese officials are being ambitious. They want to test the thousands of people who've recently attended these markets. They believe the virus may have come from a chopping board or chopping boards used to cut fish. Here's an epidemiologist at the University of Hong Kong on that theory.
Virus detected on this particular chopping board. It's not clear how it got there. They've also tested a lot of the meat, the fish, all those kind of samples. They haven't found the virus. So most likely the virus got on the chopping board from the person who was using it. We don't know where it came from, but we know there's always the chance for sporadic infections to pop up. Maybe an asymptomatic case who was infected elsewhere in China, traveled to Beijing, didn't even know he had COVID and spread it into this particular market.
Well, the Chinese authorities are now vowing to avoid a second Wuhan, to use their phrase. And normally state media would very much stress the good work in its view that's being done. However, some local Beijing media we've looked at has a decidedly downbeat tone. The Global Times is warning the risk of a further epidemic is high. It quotes the Chinese Vice Premier, all districts and departments must not have any numb thoughts, war fatigue, count on luck, or take a relaxed mentality is the warning. Then there's the People's Daily, which quotes a spokesperson for the city authorities who say Beijing has entered an extraordinary period. We should draw lessons from the pain, remain alert against the risk of the epidemic at all times, and resolutely cut off the spread of the virus. We've also seen other newspapers urging people to wear masks. Well, here's the BBC's Stephen McDonnell in Beijing on what the government is doing about all this.
They're quickly mobilising people to be able to test tens of thousands of workers or neighbours near that vast market. All very impressive, the speed with which that has taken place. However, we've also seen the general manager of that market sacked, as well as a local party secretary, other officials from the market have been called up to the local Communist Party Discipline Inspection Commission. Now, again, if you were to think, what might you do if you wanted to encourage a culture whereby cover-up is your first response? You know, where you might worry about openness and this type of thing. Well, you'd start sacking leaders anywhere where a small outbreak happened. And so for this reason, there's been some criticism of this handling of the matter, because many ordinary people in China are even asking on social media, well, why is it their fault automatically?
Now, in a moment, we'll update you on Pakistan. First, though, to India. Chennai is reimposing its lockdown on 15 million people. On Sunday, the city recorded more than 1,400 new cases, and its total is over 30,000. Local media is reporting that infections are surging in slum areas of Chennai. Now, if we look at India on a national level, we've been reporting that it's eased its lockdown in the last week or so, but the threat from COVID very much continues. New infections continue to spike, and there are over 330,000 reported cases in India. And that makes India with the fourth highest total in the world. Also, close to 10,000 people have lost their lives, and we know that Maharashtra, Gujarat and Delhi are the worst affected states. And as you can see, in Delhi, these railway carriages are now being converted into care centres, and there are fears the city's healthcare system may not be able to cope if cases continue to rise. Okay, and from there to Pakistan, it lifted its lockdown back in early May when it had a relatively low 25,000 cases. Over a month later, it has another 120,000. Health experts are saying the virus may actually not peak until July or August there, all of which, of course, is creating pressure. The New York Times is reporting people are being turned away from hospitals. Some hospitals have signs saying they're full. And the anecdotal evidence is borne out by Pakistan now being in the WHO's list of 10 countries where COVID-19 is on the rise. In fact, we know the WHO has asked for the lockdown to be reimposed. It argues none of the criteria for lifting it were met. But the government's counter-argument is that this lockdown was untenable for those living in poverty. Prime Minister Imran Khan instead favours local lockdowns around virus hotspots. He says that's necessary to ensure that the burden doesn't fall on poor people. Well, let's shift from Asia to South America, and there you'll find many more countries under pressure. A cathedral in Lima in Peru has been filled, as you can see, with the photos of over 5,000 people who died related to COVID-19. Local media is reporting that many weren't able to access adequate medical care, and that's symptomatic of the challenge for Peru. It has the second highest number of deaths and infections in South America after Brazil. Well, let's get an update. Luis Fajardo is from BBC Monitoring. He's live with us from Miami. Luis, first of all, let's talk about Peru. Does its healthcare system have sufficient facilities to cope with the number of cases?
Clearly not, and that was the center of the criticism by a very influential voice in Peru, of course, the Catholic Church, and that powerful image of the cathedral in Lima filled with all the pictures of the people who died. Clearly, Peru is facing serious difficulties in meeting the challenge presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. And even though Peru was one of the countries that originally had been praised because of its actions, particularly in economic terms, they had started a very ambitious economic aid package to try to keep people in their houses, particularly from the informal sector, who in Peru, as in many other countries of Latin America, constitute a great majority of the working population. This clearly is not working enough. They are still facing great difficulties in this aspect.
And Luis, arguably the biggest COVID-19 crisis in South America is in Brazil. There's been a lot of controversy around President Bolsonaro and his policies and his comments. Where have we got to there?
Brazil, the situation seems to get worse and worse. It is now the second country, of course, in number of deaths and number of cases after the U.S., having surpassed many other countries. There was, you may remember a few days ago, a big controversy when the Brazilian government decided to change the way it was reporting the number of deaths and the number of cases, stopping more aggregate figures and having day-by-day figures. There has been a big legal dispute about it, and many other NGOs and other organizations are stepping in to make sure that the public realizes the degree of the crisis that Brazil is facing. Of course, it is also a country that is in a process of opening its economy. And many people are warning that with many of the largest cities in the world, like Sao Paulo, preparing to completely open their economy or open to a greater extent, the situation unfortunately, can only get worse.
Luis, I only have 30 seconds or so, but can you give me a quick update on Venezuela, please?
Venezuela is the big question mark in the continent. They report very, very low cases, but many people don't trust these figures as they think that the Venezuelan health system, as the economy in general, is facing great challenges, and it's hard to believe that the cases are so few.
All right, Luis, thank you very much indeed. Luis from BBC Monitoring. Of course, there's much more detail on the COVID-19 crisis, all the countries we've mentioned via the BBC News website. I'm also seeing reports coming through that Donald Trump's given his first comment on that US Supreme Court ruling. He says it's a very powerful decision. I'll get you more details on exactly what the president's been saying about that important US Supreme Court ruling, making it illegal to fire people because of their sexuality, in the next edition of Outside Source. See you then.